Welcome to the News Review. Israel's spy chief says Bahrain and Oman could be the next Persian Gulf countries to follow in the footsteps of the UAE, that is, in officially normalizing ties with Tel Aviv. Eli Cohen added that there will also be a, quote, peace deal in the coming year between Israel and some African countries, including Sudan. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has met with Omani and Sudanese leaders in the past 2 years, including a visit to Oman in October 2018. Earlier, the UAE removed a block on telephone services with Israel as part of their new agreement to normalize bilateral relations. The US-backed normalization deal has sparked widespread condemnation across Palestine and the Muslim world in general. It has been described as treachery and an endorsement of Israeli aggression against Palestinians. Joining us on this edition of the News Review is James Tweedy. He's a journalist and commentator out of Plymouth. And we also have Max Parry, independent researcher from New York. Gentlemen, welcome. James, starting with you, these normalization ties, do you think these nations are aware that when they're normalizing ties with Israel, they're also normalizing an aspect, aggression against the Palestinians and war crimes against the Palestinians?
Well, I think it's, in the Arab world, this is a very major issue. By normalizing relations, they are de facto recognizing Israel's dominion over the occupied territories and all of, well, not over the occupied territories, but of all of historic Palestine. Which is, as they term, Israel proper. So, and furthermore, the ongoing occupation of the occupied territories. But I think what this does is it begs the question of whether Donald Trump's deal of the century was just actually a kind of leverage for something which is perhaps more useful, which is that kind of diplomatic relations, normalization of diplomatic relations, and that recognition of the state of Israel, the Zionist state. Because, and the problem with, Israel has said that it will suspend, as it says, the planned annexation of parts of the West Bank under the Trump deal. And that was always problematic. It was the kind of thing that would turn many Western countries against Israel. So this is a lot more valuable. And of course, it's not surprising that they started with the UAE, which is one of the five Gulf Cooperation Council countries. Yeah.
Yeah. Just let me bring Max in. Max, what's your thoughts on this? You got Bahrain, the UAE, Bahrain, Oman. Sudan. We should point out, maybe it's perhaps important to point out that it's the rulers of these countries. These countries don't have a democratic system by any means of the imagination. Do you think that people are also with it, or is it just the rulers who are for normalizing ties with Tel Aviv?
Well, obviously, if they do choose to go forward with restoring or normalizing relations with Israel, they're going to get a significant backlash from their own populations, for sure. But I think this is fundamentally about trying to establish a broader coalition, an anti-Iran coalition between the Sunni Arab states and Israel, which, on the surface, this might appear as a, tectonic shift in or geopolitical realignment, but these countries, as we all know, have really always had clandestine, behind-the-scenes relations. It's just now coming out in the open, and that includes diplomatic relations between Israel and the Emiratis, which, it's they've had informal relations for many years now, and that it makes sense now that there's pressure being put on their neighbors in Oman and Bahrain to follow suit and also recognize Israel. And I think we should expect that this alliance may eventually include Saudi Arabia, because this is fundamentally about establishing an anti-Iran coalition. These countries have all had behind-the-scenes relationships with each other for many years based on a mutual opposition to Iran. So I think this is part of forming a broad coalition between those states, and that may include some African countries as well, like Sudan. They've been cozying up to the Saudis and Emiratis in recent years and have been actually distancing themselves from Iran. And because of that, Israel has begun to soften its view of Sudan. And I know the Trump administration, Pompeo, has been instrumental in mediating rapprochement between Israel and Sudan.
Right, and James, just getting back to you, there was a time when the whole argument behind the Emirati argument is that, we'll go forward with this normalization in exchange for Israel not going ahead with the annexation of the West Bank. But as you alluded to earlier, but there was a time, before 1967, when they were saying, the argument was let's get the Palestinian land should be back to 1948, and then after 1967, it's like, well, the argument shifted. Let's get the land that Israel took by military force in 1967, and now it's like, let's get the land that Israel is trying to annex in the West Bank. It just doesn't add up. What's your thoughts there?
Well, yeah, I mean, of course, there's a creeping kind of surrender of more and more territory, from the UN partition plan to the effective borders after the 1948 war, and then the occupied territories in 1967 and so forth. So I think what was interesting and quite telling was in the statement from the US government that they said that the USA and Israel and UAE faced common challenges in the region. And I mean, by challenges, I took that to mean enemies. And, as my fellow guest said, the five Gulf Cooperation Council countries, with the possible exception of Qatar, which is the outlier, have, like you said, have long been in alliance with the USA and in de facto alliance with Israel. For instance, recently supporting Kurdish separatists, the PKK strand of Kurdish separatism in Syria. And they've been against not only Iran, but Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and generally the Arab republics. So this is the old, as I see it, this is the old struggle between the Arab monarchies versus the Arab republics, with the USA and the West generally on the side of the Arab monarchies.
So, Max, just 1 or 2 minutes left. Just picking up from where James concluded, can we say that this has actually got nothing to do with the Palestinians? This is, on top of all these countries and kingdoms, is Saudi Arabia, which, as James alluded to, wants to get, rid Iran of the IRGC, wants to rid the South Lebanon of the Hezbollah resistance movement, wants to rid Yemen of the Popular Ansar Allah movement, wants to rid Iraq of the Popular Mobilization movement, the anti-terror movement, and so on and so forth. But when it comes to Palestine, it doesn't want to get involved with the Palestinians.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously the Palestinians are the biggest losers in this this restoration of ties. But the truth be told, the Gulf states have never really been committed to the Palestinian cause. I mean, going all the way back to the Balfour Declaration, the Gulf states have been seen as clandestine co-conspirators with Israel, and they're suddenly openly establishing formal ties is not really as unlikely a scenario as it may seem. It's been an open secret that they've had an unofficial strategic alliance with one another. They might be incorrectly assumed to be sworn enemies, but they've had a historical covert alliance really since the end of World War I, when the first monarch of the modern Saudi state, for example, Ibn Saud, when he defeated the Sharif of Mecca, who was the one who opposed the Balfour Declaration, which, as we know, guaranteed a Jewish homeland in Palestine by colonization with European Jews. Once the Sharif of Mecca was out of the way, the Zionist movement was effectively given a green light by the Gulf states to move forward with their colonial project. And what we see now is a formation of a broader anti-Iran coalition. And, although the Gulf states have always publicly opposed Zionism, behind the scenes, they've negotiated with them and given de facto endorsement of delivering Palestine to the Jews.
There had been many reports prior to this indicating to that. I'm afraid we have run out of time. Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. Let me thank our guests, Max Parry there, independent researcher from New York, and across the pond, James Tweedy, journalist and commentator from the British capital, from the British city of Plymouth. And dear viewers, thank you for staying tuned to this edition of the News Review.